She stepped off the stagecoach in a white lace wedding dress, 1,000 miles from home, to marry a man she had never met. But the man was 3 days dead in a saloon grave. The letters had lied, and the debt he left behind had her name on it. In 1 hour, Jasper Thorne's men would come looking to collect. In two, she would be pressed against a frozen wall in a back alley with nowhere in the world to run. And the only three men who could save her were strangers she had every reason to fear. Let me tell you how Clara Whitcomb came to the Bitterroot. The alley behind the blacksmith shop in Bears Hollow smelled of coal smoke and horse sweat, and the kind of cold that bit through wool and lace alike. Clara Whitcomb pressed her back against the frozen wood of the tool shed, her breath coming in small white clouds that rose and vanished into the December dark. Her wedding dress, the one she had sewn herself by candlelight in her father's little house in St. Louis, was torn at the hem. A strip of white lace dragged in the snow like a wounded wing. Somewhere past the mouth of the alley, two men were laughing the way drunk men laugh when they have cornered something small. "Come on out, little bride," one of them called. His voice was thick and wet. "Mr. Thorne just wants a word with you. That's all. Just a word." Clara closed her eyes. She was 18 years old. She had 80 steps of alley behind her and nowhere in the world to run. In the little carpet bag still clutched against her ribs, she carried everything she owned. Her mother's gold wedding ring, a Bible bound in cracked leather, a tintype of her father taken the spring before the fire, and 3 letters from a man named Amos Creel who had promised her a home. The letters she was beginning to understand had lied. She had come west to be a wife. She had arrived to find herself a debt. The wind cut down the alley like a knife drawn slow across skin. Clara gripped her carpet bag tighter and said a small prayer not to be saved because she no longer believed in being saved, but to be forgiven for whatever she had done wrong to deserve this. And then above the laughter of the drunks, she heard something else. 3 sets of boots in the snow. Slow, steady, not hurrying because men who did not need to hurry did not hurry. A voice low and deep as a dry creek bed. "Step away from her." Clara opened her eyes. Before we go any further tonight, friend, let me say this. If you're new here, go ahead and tap that subscribe button. I tell frontier stories like this one every week, the kind your grandfather might have told you on a cold porch. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where in this wide country you're listening from tonight. I read every one of them, and it means more than you know. Now, let me take you back. Because to understand what Clara was doing in that alley in Montana territory, you have to understand what she was running from and what she was running toward, and why the letter that brought her west was already a lie before the ink had dried. 2 weeks earlier, and 1,000 miles east, in a narrow wooden house on the edge of St. Louis, Missouri, Clara Whitcomb sat at her mother's kitchen table and read an advertisement in a folded newspaper her father had set beside her teacup. The house was cold. The stove had been cold for 3 days because there was no wood, and there was no wood because there was no money. And there was no money because the fire the summer before had taken the print shop, and with it, her father's living. Eldon Whitcomb had been a newspaper man, a setter of type, a runner of presses, a quiet man who smelled of ink and pipe tobacco, and who used to read aloud to Clara in the evenings from the books her mother had loved. Clara's mother, Eliza, had been gone 2 winters, now taken by a fever that swept through the river wards one bad August. She had left behind only 3 things worth keeping. A thin gold band she had worn every day of her marriage, a leather Bible with her handwriting in the margins, and a daughter with her honey blonde hair and her cornflower blue eyes and her stubborn, hopeful heart. Clara had tried to keep them afloat. She had taken in mending. She had tutored the grocer's children in their letters. She had washed other women's linens until her hands cracked and bled. It had not been enough. The men from the bank came to the door twice a week now, polite and hungry the way bankmen are. And so one gray afternoon, her father had laid the newspaper down beside her tea and pointed with one ink-stained finger to a square of small print in the classifieds. Strong woman needed, the advertisement read. Honest Montana rancher, landowner, and cattleman seeks a virtuous wife for matrimonial union. Passage and wedding attire provided. Respectable, reply only. Mr. Amos Creel Bears, Hollow, Montana territory. Clara read it once and then again and then a third time because the words refused to settle. Her father sat down across from her. He looked older than he was. His hair had gone white at the temples in the years since the fire, and his hands, the hands that had set 1,000 pages of type, shook a little now when he was tired. He folded them on the table in front of her like a man about to say grace. Clara, he said, and his voice was very quiet, I do not want to do this. You are to understand that first before anything else. I do not want to do this. I know, Papa, but I am afraid, and I think you are afraid too, and too proud to say so. Clara looked down at her tea. She did not trust her voice. I have written to him, Eldon Whitcomb said. 3 letters. He is a plain man. He does not make pretty words. But he owns land, Clara. He has cattle and a house. He says he will treat you kindly. He says he needs a good woman, and I believe a good woman is what you are. Have you met him, Papa? No. Do you know anyone who has? No. She raised her eyes then, and she saw her father's face, and she saw the tears he was not letting fall, and she understood that this was not a question he was asking. It was a thing he had already decided, the way that a drowning man decides to let go of the rope, because holding on will take the boat down with him. She set her teacup down. I will write the reply, she said. 3 short letters came back from Montana territory over the next 10 days. They were not warm, they were not cruel. They were the letters of a man who wrote only what he had to write. The first acknowledged her father's terms. The second enclosed a bank draft for passage and a sum for a proper bridal dress, because, and here Clara had felt her throat tighten, a woman should arrive looking like what she is intended to be. The third told her the date to expect the stagecoach from Helena to Bears Hollow, and instructed her to ask at the telegraph office for Mr. Amos Creel. That was all. No soft word, no promise beyond the practical, not even a question about who she was. Clara used the bridal money to buy white lace and good navy wool. She sewed the dress herself alone at her mother's old sewing table in the evenings after her father had gone to bed. She sewed slowly, not because she did not know how to sew fast, but because with every stitch, she was trying to make herself believe that she was becoming a bride and not a parcel. The lace at the throat she finished with her mother's tiny cameo brooch. The sleeves she set with small pearl buttons saved from Eliza's own wedding dress. When it was done, she laid it flat on the bed and looked at it for a long time, and she tried to feel like a woman about to begin a life and not like a girl about to be mailed. On the morning she left, her father walked her to the depot. He carried her small trunk himself, though his hands were shaking, and she could see the cost of it in his jaw. At the platform, he took her face between his palms, the way he had when she was a little girl frightened of thunder. You are your mother's daughter, he told her. Whatever waits for you out there, Clara, you are her daughter, and she is watching you from a better place than this one. Be brave, be kind, keep your word. And if the day comes when you have to choose between being a good woman and being a safe one, you choose good. Your mother chose good. It is how I married her. He kissed her forehead. She felt his tears on her skin. I love you, Papa. And I love you, my girl. That was the last time Clara Whitcomb saw her father. The stagecoach pulled away from the St. Louis platform into a cold, gray morning. And with every mile of track in Wagon Road West, the wedding dress in her trunk grew a little heavier, and the letters in her carpet bag grew a little lighter. Until at last, on the 18th day of December, in the year 1878, she stepped down from a rattling coach into the snow of Bears Hollow, Montana territory, and began to understand what she had been sent to. Bears Hollow was not a town so much as a scar. It sat hunched in a narrow cut at the foot of the Bitterroot Mountains, 12 buildings of gray weathered pine leaning into one another like tired men at a bar. A blacksmith's forge sent up black smoke at the north end. 2 saloons faced each other across the frozen mud of the single street, the larger one a 2-story affair with a crooked sign that read Lucky Ace in faded red paint. A general store, a telegraph and stage depot, a feed shed, a few crooked cabins where the miners slept, when the weather drove them down from their claims. The sky above the hollow was the color of wet iron. Snow had been falling all afternoon and was still falling, fine and steady, the kind of snow that meant the real storm was still coming. Clara stepped down from the stagecoach in her white lace wedding dress, in her thin city shoes, and every man on the boardwalks stopped what he was doing and looked. They did not look at her the way a town looks at a bride. They looked at her the way wolves look at a fawn in open country. The driver tossed her small trunk into the snow beside her and slapped his reins and was gone before she had fully caught her breath. She stood there for a moment with the wind pulling at the torn hem of her skirt and the snow settling in her hair like a second colder veil. She lifted her chin because she did not know what else to do with it. Her mother had taught her that when you did not know what to do, you stood up straight. It did not help you decide, but it helped you bear the deciding. She walked to the telegraph office. The men on the porch of the Lucky Ace did not stop watching her. One of them laughed, and the laugh followed her through the depot door like a hand on the back of her neck. Inside, a pot-bellied stove glowed red. The air was thick with the smell of kerosene and burnt coffee and old paper. A thin man in wire spectacles looked up from his ledger, and his face did something that Clara had never seen a stranger's face do before, not for her. It fell. Not with surprise, not with curiosity, with pity. "Yes, miss," he said slowly as if stalling for time. "My name is Clara Whitcomb," she said. Her voice was smaller than she wanted it to be. "I have come from St. Louis. I am to meet Mr. Amos Creel. I was told to ask for him here." The thin man closed his ledger. He took off his spectacles and cleaned them slowly on the hem of his waistcoat. When he put them back on, he looked at her again, and she could see that he was trying to find a kind way to say something that had no kind way. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "my name is Quinlan Perkins. I run this depot, and I am very sorry to be the man who has to say this to you." "Say what, sir?" "Mr. Creel is dead." The red stove, the smell of coffee, the tick of the clock on the wall behind him, the way the light came in gray through the frost on the window. Clara remembered all of it later for the rest of her life with a clarity that no happy moment ever quite matched, because those were the last details of the old world, the world where she still believed the letters. "Dead," she repeated. 3 days ago, there was a card game at the Lucky Ace. It turned ugly. A man put a knife in him over a jack of spades. He was gone before anyone thought to send for the undertaker. Clara set her carpet bag down on the floor beside her feet, very carefully, as if it were made of glass. "I see," she said, and then because she did not see, because the world was tilting. "What am I to do now, Mr. Perkins?" Quinlan Perkins looked at her for a long moment. She could see him measuring something behind his spectacles. She could see him deciding whether to give her a kind lie or the truth. He chose the truth, and Clara Whitcomb would remember that too for as long as she drew breath. "Miss Whitcomb," he said quietly, "I need you to listen very carefully because I do not know how much time we have. Amos Creel was not a rancher. He was a gambler. He owned a room above the Lucky Ace and a pile of debts taller than he was. The largest of those debts was owed to a man named Jasper Thorne, who runs the mines up the canyon and by extension runs this town. But the letters, they said he had land. They said there was a house, a cattle ranch. The letters said what Creel needed them to say to get what he needed, which was you." She did not understand yet. He saw that she did not understand. He pulled a drawer open beneath the counter and took out a folded sheet of paper and laid it flat in front of her. The handwriting at the top was not her father's, but it bore her father's signature at the bottom and Amos Creel's scrawl beside it and a third signature she did not know. "He left this in his room," Perkins said. "I went through his papers after the knife fight because nobody else was going to and because I had a bad feeling. And this is what I found." Clara read the paper. It was a bond of debt drawn up in the rough legal language of frontier contracts. Amos Creel acknowledged a sum owed to J. Thorne of Bears Hollow, and at the bottom in a line that made Clara's hands go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather was a clause. She read it twice, then 3 times. The words did not change. Should the undersigned fail to make full settlement of said debt, any property cargo, or bonded passenger delivered to the undersigned's address shall be forfeit to the holder of this note, J. Thorne in partial or full satisfaction as he sees fit. Bonded passenger. Clara lifted her eyes to Quinlan Perkins. Her lips moved before the sound came. He sold me, she whispered, before I ever arrived. He sold me to pay his gambling debt. Your father did not know, miss. I am sure of that. Your father thought he was sending you to a husband. Creel's letters were built to make an honest man trust them. But the truth is Creel never meant to marry you. He meant to hand you to Jasper Thorne the moment you stepped off the coach. And then I suppose he got himself killed over a card game before the handoff could be made, which is the only reason you are still standing here breathing, Miss Whitcomb. Clara put both hands flat on the counter to hold herself upright. The room had begun to tilt very slowly to one side like a ship taking on water. Mr. Perkins, she said, and her voice sounded far away, what does Mr. Thorne do with women he collects his debts? Quinlan Perkins did not answer that question. He did not have to. His silence was louder than any words he might have found. That was when the boots hit the boardwalk outside. 3 sets, maybe 4. Heavy. Not hurrying, but not strolling either. The boots of men who had been told where to go and what to bring back. Perkins went gray. They have heard the stage came in, he said. They will have been watching. Miss Whitcomb, listen to me. There is a door at the back of this office. It opens onto the alley behind the smithy. You take it now. You run. Do not go to the saloon. Do not go to the hotel. There is nowhere in this town you will be safe, but the alley buys you minutes. Find the road north. Pray for mercy. I will stall them as long as I can. My trunk, my father's letters, I cannot just leave it. Leave all of it. Your life is worth more than your trunk. Go now, go. And Clara Whitcomb, 18 years old, bride to a dead man, property of a debt she had never signed, picked up her carpet bag with her mother's ring inside it, and she ran. She ran out the back door into the wind. She ran past the forge where the coals glowed orange through the slats. She ran until her thin city shoes slipped on the ice and her breath tore at her lungs, and the torn lace of her wedding dress dragged bloody trails in the snow where it caught on splinters. And she ran into the alley behind the blacksmith shop, and she pressed her back against the frozen wood of the tool shed. And that is where we began, a friend, because that is where the 2 drunk men came laughing down the alley after her, sure of their prize, certain that a small bride in a white dress could not go far. And that is where above their laughter, a voice like dry creek stone said, "Step away from her." Clara opened her eyes. At the mouth of the alley, framed against the pale snow of the street, stood 3 men who had not been there a moment before. They stood the way a wall stands, shoulder to shoulder, not crowded each in his own square of ground. They were not hurrying. They were not shouting. They looked like they had been cut out of the mountain that loomed behind the town and set down here for a purpose none of them particularly enjoyed. The man in the center was the tallest. 6'6", maybe more, wrapped in a long sheepskin coat gone dark at the shoulders from melted snow. His hat was pulled low. A Winchester rifle rested easy in his hands, the way a carpenter holds a hammer he has used for 20 years. Under the brim of the hat, Clara could just make out a hard jaw shadowed with several days of beard, a straight nose that had been broken once long ago, and a pale scar that ran from the outer corner of his left eye down along the line of his jaw like a river drawn on a map. His eyes, when they found her in the dark of the alley, were the color of whiskey held up to a lamp. The man on his left was nearly as tall and a little leaner, golden-haired, beneath a darker hat, a double-barreled shotgun held across his chest with both hands. His face was younger and kinder around the mouth, the face of a man who knew how to smile, even if he did not smile often. The man on his right was the youngest of the 3 and the most wound up. You could see it in the way he held himself, as if his own skin was too tight for him. Dark auburn hair, sharp blue eyes like chipped stone, a Colt revolver already drawn, and low at his hip. He was the one you watched if you were one of the drunks because he was the one who would move first. The tall man in the center spoke again. He did not raise his voice. I said, step away from her. I will not say it a third time. Bo and Jim, the two men from the Lucky Ace, turned slowly in the narrow alley. Clara saw the moment the drink went out of their eyes and the fear came in. They knew these three. Everyone in Bears Hollow knew these three and knew that there were names you did not cross and that at the top of that short list were the names of the brothers Hollowgrove of the Bitterroot. Hollowgrove, Bo said. The word left his mouth slowly the way a man sets down a loaded gun. This ain't your business. This here is Mr. Thorne's property. We got a paper on her. You have a drunk in an alley with his hand on a girl's wrist, the tall man said. I do not care what paper you have. You take that hand off her now or I take the hand off at the wrist. Hollowgrove, you can't just... The youngest brother's Colt came up. Not fast, slow, deliberate, inevitable. It was worse than fast. Fast was a man in a panic. Slow was a man who had already decided. Bo let go of Clara's wrist. We will be telling Mr. Thorne, he said, backing away. We will be telling Mr. Thorne all about this. You do that, said the man in the center. You tell him Silas Hollowgrove has her now, and if he wants to discuss it, he knows where to find me. The two drunks half stumbled, half ran down the alley and out into the street. In a moment they were gone, and the alley was quiet again, and there were only 4 people in it. Clara pressed against the shed wall, her wedding dress in ruins, and the 3 brothers of the Bitterroot standing in the snow as if they had always been standing there and always would be. The one with the golden hair lowered his shotgun first. He moved carefully the way a man moves around a frightened horse. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat, shrugged it off his shoulders, and held it out toward her at arm's length. The coat was still warm. Clara could see the warmth rising off it in the cold air. Ma'am, he said, and his voice was softer than she had expected, soft the way a fiddle played low is soft. I am not going to come any closer than this. You take the coat if you want. My name is Obadiah Hollowgrove. Folks call me Obi. This is my older brother, Silas, and that is our younger brother, Ransom. And you have got nothing to fear from any one of us. Not tonight. Not ever. Clara's hands were shaking too hard to hold the coat. Obi saw that. He laid the coat across the top of a crate beside her and stepped back without once coming within arm's reach. The youngest brother, Ransom, had not holstered his Colt. He was watching the mouth of the alley, his jaw tight, and Clara understood that his not holstering it was a kindness too in its way. It meant he was still between her and whatever else was out there. The tall one, Silas, did something then that Clara did not expect. He handed his Winchester to Obi without looking at it, and he walked forward through the snow, slow and unhurried, until he was 3 paces from her. Then he crouched down, all the way down until he was sitting back on his heels in the snow, and his whiskey-colored eyes were lower than hers. He did it so that she would not have to look up at him. She understood that later. But right then, she only knew that the biggest man she had ever seen had just made himself smaller on purpose, and that no man had ever done such a thing for her before. Miss, he said, my name is Silas Hollowgrove. I live about 2 hours' ride west of here, up in the Bitterroot, in a cabin my father built with his own hands. I have got 2 brothers you have already met, and I have got beds and a fire and food enough to keep a house. I do not know your story, and I do not need to know it yet. I only need to tell you this. If you stay in Bears Hollow tonight, you will not live to see morning. I do not say that to frighten you. I say it because it is true, and a man ought not lie to a woman in trouble. Clara tried to speak. Her voice came out in a thin white thread. I was going to be married. Silas's jaw moved. Something went across his eyes. Whatever it was gentler than anything else in his face. I know, miss. I can see the dress. He is dead. I heard that too. I have nowhere. You have somewhere now, if you want it. I am not a husband. I am not going to be a husband. I am a man with a warm cabin and a mother in a grave who would haunt me the rest of my days if I left a girl in your shape to freeze in a Bears Hollow alley. That is the offer, miss, and it is the whole offer. You come up the mountain with us tonight. No one lays a hand on you. No one asks anything of you. You sleep under a roof. You eat at our table. Come the thaw, if you want to go east, I will put you on a stagecoach myself. If you want to go to Helena, I will ride you there. If you want to stay, we will figure out what staying means. But tonight you come with us or you die here. Those are the two roads I can see from where I am sitting. Clara looked past him at Obi, who was holding both long guns, now the shotgun and the Winchester one in each hand, the way a man holds tools at the end of a day's work. She looked at Ransom, still watching the alley mouth with that hard young face of his. She looked back at Silas Hollowgrove crouched in the snow in front of her, making himself small so she could feel safe. And somewhere inside her, under the terror and the shame and the cold and the grief for a father who had meant only to save her Clara, Wickham felt a very small thing that she had not felt since she had read that advertisement on a cold kitchen table in St. Louis. She felt the thin, unfamiliar warmth of being seen by a decent man. She did not trust it. She did not know yet if she could trust it, but she felt it. "All right," she whispered. "All right, what, miss?" "All right, I will come with you." Silas nodded once, slow and grave, as if she had just handed him a heavy thing to carry, and he meant to carry it properly. "Then we had better ride," he said, "because that storm off the pass is not going to wait on us." They took her out the back way through lots and behind sheds, Obie leading Silas one step behind her, Ransom bringing up the rear with that Colt still loose in his hand. They did not go back through the main street. They did not make her pass the Lucky Ace. Silas had thought about it before he moved. Clara could feel the thinking in the way he placed each step, in the way he chose each corner. He was a man who did not do anything by accident. Their horses were tied in a stand of cottonwoods north of town. Three big mountain mounts rough-coated and patient in the snow breath, steaming in the gray air. The biggest of them was a black gelding whose shoulder came higher than Clara's head. Silas laid a hand flat on the black's neck and spoke to him low in a language that was no language, just the soft sounds a man uses with an animal he trusts. "This is Midnight," he said to Clara. "He has carried heavier loads than you across worse country. You are going to ride up here in front of me because that dress is not going to keep you alive against this wind, and my coat will. Is that all right?" She nodded. She did not trust her voice. He swung up, first settled in the saddle and reached down one long arm. She took it. His hand closed around her forearm, warm and rough as bark, and he lifted her as if she weighed nothing and set her sideways in front of him. He opened his heavy sheepskin coat and drew it around her, wrapping her in wool and the scent of pine smoke and leather and something else, something older and cleaner that she would later understand was just the smell of a man who lived honestly among trees. His arm came around her waist to take the reins, not tight, not close, only as close as a man had to be to keep a woman from falling off a horse. It was the first time in her life that Clara had been held by a man's arm and had not felt the urge to pull away. Obie rode out ahead on a gray horse named Scout Breaking Trail. Ransom rode behind on a bay called Ranger Rifle across his thighs, now watching their back trail. Silas guided Midnight up into the black timber north of Bear's Hollow, and the town fell away behind them into the snow like a bad dream giving ground to a worse one. The storm came down off the pass an hour into the ride. It came the way mountain storms come all at once, like a hand clapping shut. The wind went from cold to killing in the space of a breath. The snow stopped falling straight and began falling sideways in long white knives that stung Clara's cheeks and burned her eyes. The light, what little of it there had been, went out of the world. Clara could not see Obie ahead of them. She could barely see Midnight's ears. Silas leaned forward over her shoulder so she could hear him above the wind. His beard brushed her hair. "I have got you," he said. "Midnight knows this trail in his sleep. You close your eyes if you want. You rest. We will be home in an hour." She did not close her eyes, but she did lean back just a little into the wall of him, and she asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the alley. "Mr. Hollowgrove, why are you doing this for me?" You do not know me." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought perhaps the wind had torn the question away before it reached him. Then his voice came low right at her ear. "Because of my mother, miss. Her name was Marin Ashcroft before it was Hollow. She came out of Boston in the spring of 1854. She was a preacher's daughter. She had been promised to a man in Helena. She had never laid eyes on a man who had sent her letters and money for passage. She got to Helena and found out that man had died of fever 3 days before her stage arrived. She had nothing. Not a friend, not a dollar, not a roof. And my father, who happened to be in Helena that week buying horses, found her sitting on her trunk in front of the depot with snow in her hair and no place in the world to go." Clara felt her heart turn over. "He took her home," Silas went on. "Not to marry. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman. He took her home because she had nowhere else to be, and because leaving her on that bench would have been the same as killing her, and a man does not kill a woman to save himself the trouble of being decent. 3 years later, when she was good and ready, and he had courted her proper, they married. For love, not for arrangement. And they had 3 boys up in the Bitterroot, and they loved each other until the day they died, which was not the day of their choosing." He paused. "So when a man like me sees a girl in a white dress alone in a Bear's Hollow alley with Jasper Thorne's men laughing at her, that man does not ride on miss. That man does what his father would have done, because otherwise his mother would haunt him out of her grave, and deservedly." Clara pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. The tears that came then were not the tears of the alley or the telegraph office. They were something else. They were tears at the shape of the world being against all of her expectations, not cruel for one single moment. "She sounds like a good woman," she said into his coat. "She was the best woman I ever knew," Silas Hollow said. "Until tonight I would have said the only one." The cabin came up out of the storm like a ship out of fog. It was bigger than she had expected. 2 full stories of stacked pine logs, chink-tight roof, pitched steep so the snow would slide. Smoke climbed from a big stone chimney on the south wall and was immediately torn to ribbons by the wind. A heavy porch ran the length of the front, and on the porch 2 oil lamps burned in iron brackets, yellow and warm and alive. Beside the cabin stood a tall barn and a split-rail corral and a woodshed stacked clean to the eaves with what looked like years of labor. Someone had cut a path through the snow from the barn door to the cabin door and swept it again within the hour. Obie was already off his horse and opening the barn. Ransom swung down and moved around to Clara's side of midnight with that wound-up grace of his, and Silas passed her down to his brothers, reaching hands as carefully as if she were made of glass blown thin. Ransom set her on her feet in the snow, steadied her by the elbows for one bare moment until her legs remembered how to hold her, and then stepped back the polite distance of a man who had no intention of crowding a frightened woman. "Inside, ma'am," he said, and his voice when he used it was rougher than either of his brothers' rough, in a way that sounded like it hurt him a little to be gentle. "Fire's laid, coffee's hot, we have got you." The door opened under his hand, and warmth rolled out to meet her like a living thing. Clara stepped across the threshold of the Hollow cabin on the night of December 18th, 1878, out of the killing wind and into a room that smelled of pine smoke and leather oil and fresh bread and something else, something she had not smelled in 2 long years since her mother died. It smelled like a home. She stood just inside the door and looked at it with the blank, wide eyes of a woman who had been preparing herself to die in an alley. A big stone firelace on the far wall threw orange light across a scrubbed plank floor. A long table of hand-planed pine sat at the center of the room with benches down either side. A kettle steamed on the hob. A black iron stove in the kitchen corner ticked quietly as it cooled. Against one wall stood a tall shelf with perhaps 24 books on it, their spines worn soft with rereading. A rocking chair with a faded quilt folded over its arm waited beside the hearth. On the mantel, a small pewter cross and a tintype of a smiling woman with dark hair pinned up in the old Boston way. Clara lifted her hand toward that tintype without thinking. My mother, Silas said quietly behind her. Marin. She is beautiful. Yes, ma'am, she was. Obi had come in with an armload of wood and was already feeding the fire. Ransom had disappeared upstairs and came back down with a folded wool blanket as thick as a bearskin and laid it over the rocking chair. Silas unwrapped his big coat from around Clara and hung it on a peg by the door, then stepped back from her so that she was not crowded. Sit, he said, nodding to the rocker. Obi will heat you something. Ransom will see to the horses. I will bring your bag up from the saddle once you are warm. You are safe here, Clara Whitcomb. You hear me say it. Under this roof, no man in the world gets past these three brothers to touch one hair on your head. That is my word, and my word is a thing I have never broken. Clara lowered herself slowly into Marin Hollowgrove's rocking chair. The blanket Ransom had laid there smelled of cedar. The fire warmed the raw red of her hands. The kettle sang. Somewhere outside, the storm raged on against the log walls and could not get in. She looked up at Silas, and then at Obi at the fire, and then at the door where Ransom had gone out again into the snow to tend their animals first because that was the order of things in a decent house, and she felt the first real crack go through the wall she had built around her heart. I need to tell you something, she said. All of it. Before you feed me. Before you give me a bed. I need you to know what you have brought home so you can still turn me out if it is too much. Silas sat down on the bench opposite her, forearms on his knees, and nodded once. Tell us then. We are listening. And she did. She told them about the fire at the print shop and her mother in the ground and the bankmen at the door. She told them about the advertisement laid beside her teacup. She told them about Eldon Whitcomb shaking hands and his eyes full of tears he would not let fall. She told them about the white dress she had sewn alone at her mother's table. She told them about the stagecoach and the telegraph office and Quinlan Perkins and the folded paper he had pulled from a drawer. She told them about the word bonded and what it meant. She told them the name Jasper Thorne, and when she said it, she saw the three brothers go still in the particular way that family goes still when an old wound is touched. When she was done, the room held quiet for a long moment. Then Silas Hollowgrove spoke. Clara, he said, and it was the first time he used her given name, and he used it carefully like a man lifting a china cup. I need to tell you something back, because you have been honest, and honesty deserves honest in return. That name you just said, Jasper Thorne. 12 years ago on a March night in 1866, a lamp fell in our barn. A lamp that did not fall by itself. Our father Barnaby was trying to get the horses out. Our mother Marin went in after him because he did not come back fast enough. I was 19 years old. Obi was 16, Ransom was 14, and too small to hold me back when I ran for that door. The barn went up while I was still inside it. I got my brothers clear. I did not get my parents clear. This scar on my face is the last thing that barn gave me before it let me go. Clara could not breathe. Why, she whispered. Why would anyone do such a thing? Because my father would not sell this mountain to Jasper Thorne. Thorne wanted to run his mines up into our valley. My father said no. A month later, there was the lamp that fell by itself. There was no proof. There was never any proof. There was only a man in town who bought drinks for weeks afterwards and laughed a little too easy when the fire was mentioned. My brothers and I buried our parents up the ridge under a big tamarack tree, and we built this cabin out of what we had left, and we have kept ourselves to this mountain ever since. Because a man with no proof and three younger brothers to raise cannot afford a war. He looked up at her, and the whiskey in his eyes had gone very dark. Tonight, Clara Whitcomb, by the act of bringing you home up this mountain, we have put ourselves back in a war with Jasper Thorne. I want you to understand that because I do not want you to thank us for a kindness without knowing the shape of what comes next. You did not cost us this war. Thorne started it 12 years ago. But you will be living inside it now with us until it ends. And it may not end gently. Clara looked at him. This huge, quiet man with the scar and the slow voice and the eyes like held-up whiskey. And she thought of her father at the St. Louis depot saying, if you ever have to choose between being a good woman and a safe one, you choose good. Mr. Holligrove, she said, I have been safe for exactly none of my life. I am not going to miss it. Something moved at the corner of Silas's mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the first promise of one filed away for some better day. Then welcome home, he said, for as long as home is what you want it to be. Obie ladled stew from the big kettle into a tin bowl and set it on the table beside her with a hunk of dark bread and a mug of strong coffee. Ransom came in from the barn, stamping snow off his boots, and hung his hat on the peg beside his brother's. The three of them moved around the warm kitchen with the unspoken choreography of men who had been tending each other in this house for a dozen years, and they let Clara eat in her rocking chair by the fire without staring and without hovering, the way decent men let a wounded creature take back a little ground. When she had eaten and the edge had come off the cold in her bones, Silas showed her up the pine staircase to his own room in the eaves. It was a plain room, a rope bed with a heavy quilt, a washstand, a pair of folded wool trousers, and a red flannel shirt set out neatly on a chair. These were mine when I was about 17, so they may come near fitting, he said. Your dress is going to need mending and drying, and maybe more than mending, and you are going to need warm things. These are the warmest I have that will come close. I will sleep in the barn tonight and every night for as long as I have to, because a woman ought to have her own door. That door has a bolt. You throw it behind me when I go, and you do not open it for anything but Obie's voice or mine in the morning. Do you understand me, Clara? Yes. Say it back to me. I throw the bolt. I do not open the door. Good. He moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and turned back as if something had caught at him, and he spoke without quite meeting her eyes, looking somewhere at the quilt instead. My mother used to say a thing when any of us boys came in out of a bad night. She used to say, winter always ends, Silas. Winter always ends. She said it so often, I quit hearing it for a while. I have been thinking about it tonight, riding home with you in front of me on that horse. I think maybe it has been a long winter up here for a good while. For you too, I would guess. I do not know what the spring is going to look like, but I know winter always ends. My mother was not wrong about much. He did not wait for her to answer. He closed the door quietly behind him, and Clara heard his heavy boots on the stairs and then on the porch, and then fading away toward the barn through the rush of the wind. She slid the bolt. She stood in the middle of the room for a long time with her hand pressed to her mouth. Then she sat down on the edge of Silas Holligrove's rope bed in a borrowed red flannel shirt that smelled of pine and honest work, and she took her mother's thin gold ring out of the carpet bag and held it tight in her fist, and she cried. She cried for her dead mother and for her father alone in the St. Louis house, waiting for a letter that would tell him his daughter was a married woman and a safe one, and for the girl in the white lace dress who had believed the three letters from Amos Creel, and for the bonded passenger who would not have lived to see sunrise without three strangers in a snow alley. She cried until the crying was done. And then, because she had not slept more than a handful of hours in 2 days, she lay down on the quilt in her borrowed flannel shirt and pulled Marin Ashcroft Holligrove's heavy old blanket up to her chin, and she fell asleep to the sound of the bitterroot wind breaking itself against the log walls of a house that had been built by a man who took in strangers. Down in the warm kitchen, below, three brothers sat around the long pine table with fresh coffee in their hands and did not say much for a long while. It was Ransom who broke the silence the way Ransom always did. His young jaw was tight. His knuckles were white around his cup. Silas, they will come for her. I know. They will come up this mountain, and they will bring Zeke Thorne and half the lucky ace behind him. I know, Ransom. Then what do we do? Silas Holligrove looked into the fire for a long moment. The orange light caught the long, pale scar down his jaw and made it look almost like something honorable instead of something broken. When he spoke, his voice was the same quiet voice he had used in the alley. We do what our father would have done, he said. We stand between the storm and the house, all three of us, for as long as it takes. Because a girl in a white dress came up this mountain tonight with nothing in the world but her mother's ring and a carpet bag, and on my name and his name and hers, she is not going back down it as any man's property. Not while there is breath in a hollow grove, not tonight, not ever. Obi set his cup down quiet on the pine. Then we had better sleep in shifts, he said. Yes, and we had better not tell her yet how bad it is going to get. No. Outside, the Bitterroot storm leaned its whole weight against the cabin walls and could not move them. Upstairs, a girl from St. Louis slept for the first time in a roof she could almost believe in. And somewhere down in Bears Hollow, in a back room above the Lucky Ace, a man named Jasper Thorne was being told by two bruised and sobered men that the Hollow Grove brothers had walked into his business and had walked out with his bonded passenger and had ridden her up into the mountain that he had been waiting 12 long years to finish taking. Jasper Thorne smiled when he heard it. He smiled the way he had smiled the night of the fire in 1866. Well, he said, well, after all this time, the Hollow Groves have finally given me a reason. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and raised it to the dark window in the invisible mountain beyond. To the winter, he said softly, and to whatever comes of it. And upstairs in the cabin on the Bitterroot above the quiet crackle of a stranger's hearth, Clara Whitcomb turned in her sleep and for the first time since leaving St. Louis did not dream of the dress. Clara woke before the sun the way frightened things do not, knowing for a moment where she was. The ceiling above her was low and pitched rough pine beams darkened by years of wood smoke. A quilt she did not own lay heavy across her shoulders. A red flannel shirt that was not hers hung loose from her small frame. And somewhere in the walls of the house she could hear the quiet sounds of a home already at work in the pre-dawn dark. The stove lid opening, the scrape of a coffee pot settling onto iron, the soft tread of a man in heavy socks who had taken his boots off out of courtesy for a sleeping guest. She lay still and listened to those sounds for a long while. She had forgotten that a morning could sound like this. Her last memory of such a morning was her mother humming over a skillet in the St. Louis kitchen, and Clara had been 13 years old, and the world had not yet begun to take things from her. She slid the bolt quietly and came down the narrow pine stairs in Silas Hollowgrove's old flannel shirt and the borrowed wool trousers cuffed 3 times at the ankle, her honey blonde hair a little wild from sleep, her cornflower blue eyes still red at the rims from crying. She had thought she would feel shame coming down into a house full of strange men in a man's shirt. Instead, she felt very faintly like a child coming down to a kitchen on a cold morning where there was someone alive who loved her. Obi was at the stove. He looked up when her foot touched the bottom step, and he smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen on a Hollowgrove face. It was a careful smile, the kind a man gives a wild animal he does not want to startle. His golden hair was damp at the temples where he had just washed. He had a wooden spoon in one hand and a tin mug in the other, and a streak of cornmeal on his sleeve from whatever he was stirring in the pot. "Good morning, Miss Whitcomb," he said soft as though the word morning itself might break. "I hope you got a little sleep. That storm rattled the stovepipe half the night, and I figured you might not." "A little," she said. "Thank you for everything." "No thanks owed this early in the day. Coffee is hot. Cornmeal mush is almost done. Silas laid out some things for you on the bench there. He said you were not to feel obliged to wear them. He said only that they would be warmer than what you came in." She looked where he had nodded. On the long pine bench beside the table, folded with the square, patient precision of a man who had done it slowly and on purpose, sat a stack of clothes. A thicker wool shirt in deep forest green, heavier trousers of brown canvas, a pair of knitted gray socks, a soft knit cap the color of cream, and on top of it all, a long wool shawl of faded rose-worn soft by years of shoulders that were not hers. Clara touched the shawl, and Obi saw her touch it, and Obi said very quietly, "That was our mother's. Silas got it out of the cedar chest last night after you went to sleep. He said a woman on this mountain in December ought to have a shawl, and the only woman's shawl in this house is hers, and he reckoned she would not mind." Clara did not trust her voice for a moment. She folded the shawl against her chest and felt the cedar smell of it rise up to her clean and old and female, and she thought, so this is what it is to be cared for without being owned. Tell him, she said and had to start again. Tell him I will wear it kindly. I will tell him when he comes in from the horses. She ate the cornmeal mush with butter and a little honey from a crock on the table. She drank the strong black coffee out of a tin cup that had a dent in the rim. Ransom came in from the barn halfway through her breakfast with snow on his auburn hair and a scowl pinned to his face that seemed to be his everyday expression. And he nodded to her without quite looking at her and hung his hat on the peg beside the door and went to wash at the basin in the corner. Clara understood watching him move that this was not unfriendliness. This was a man who did not know yet what to do with a woman in his kitchen and who was afraid that whatever he did would be the wrong thing and so was doing as little as possible until he could figure it out. Silas came in last because Silas had been out since before the sun, and Silas was the sort of man who would come in last from a coal barn for the rest of his life. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her. She had put on his mother's shawl. His whiskey-colored eyes moved slow across her, from the worn rose wool at her shoulders to the two large green flannels to the cuffed brown trousers to the gray knit socks, and something in his face did a thing it had not done in the alley and had not done on the horse in the storm. It softened, not much, just around the mouth, just at the corners of the eyes where the long, pale scar ran down his jaw. But she saw it, and she would remember it. "The shawl fits," he said at last. "It is the warmest thing I have ever worn, Mr. Hollow. Silas," he said, "please, under this roof, I am not Mr. Anything, Clara. I have not been for a very long time." She nodded. She could not yet say his name aloud, but she nodded, and that was enough for him. The first week on the mountain was the longest week of Clara Whitcomb's life, and also the kindest, and she would not understand until much later that these two things often live in the same house. Obie showed her the cabin in slow daylight because Silas had ridden out to check the western traps, and Ransom had gone to haul ice from the creek, and Obie was the brother with the gentlest voice and the most patience for questions. He walked her through the downstairs room where the washpine table stood and the stone hearth burned low, and he showed her the pegs where coats hung in order of who came in and went out, most often his own on the left, then Silas's, then Ransom's. He showed her the big black iron stove and the dry sink and the shelves above it, where Marin Ashcroft Hollowgrove had once kept her jars of honey and her tin of cinnamon and her small blue bottle of vanilla extract all those years ago. The cinnamon tin was empty now. The blue bottle still held a last inch of vanilla, and no one had touched it since 1866. He took her out the back door in her wool shawl and her borrowed socks and a pair of heavy boots 2 sizes too large, and he walked her slowly past the barn where 4 horses stood in their stalls blowing steam into the cold morning air. Midnight, the big black gelding that had carried her up the mountain. Scout Obie's steady gray. Ranger the bay, belonging to Ransom, short-coupled and quick-eyed. And a 4th horse Clara had not seen the night before. An old chestnut mare with white hairs around her eyes and a kindness in her face that made Clara reach up without thinking to lay a hand on her nose. "That is Daisy," Obie said. "She was our mother's. She was a yearling when Mama came out from Boston. She is 24 years old, and she has outlived Mama by 12. She does not carry riders anymore because her back will not take it. But we have not had the heart to stop feeding her. So she lives in that stall like an old grandmother, and she eats oats, and she looks out of the window, and she remembers." Clara pressed her forehead against Daisy's warm cheek and closed her eyes and felt something move very slowly inside her chest, the way a stone turns over in a creek after a long rain. Obie showed her the woodshed stacked clean to the rafters, 5 good cords at least. He showed her which was the fast-burning pine for kindling a cold morning fire, and which was the slow-burning oak for holding coals through a long night. He showed her the smokehouse with the long strips of venison and elk hanging dark as old leather, and the root cellar cut into the hill behind the house where the glass jars of put-up tomatoes and green beans and wild plums sat in rows like a small army Marin had left behind to feed her sons through winters she would never see. He showed her the little forge at the end of the barn, where Ransom did the ironwork for the family, shoeing the horses, mending the hinges, sharpening the axes, and he told her that Ransom had ridden with the Powder River Cavalry for 2 seasons after he turned 18 and had come back from the frontier wars quieter than he had left, and that the forge was where Ransom went when the memories were too loud. "We do not ask him about it," Obie said. "And he does not offer. If you ever hear him up in the night, Clara, do not follow him. Let him sit with the fire. He will come back when he is ready." "I understand. I thought you might." Last of all, Obie took her back into the main room of the cabin and showed her the narrow corner beside the front window where his own small table stood. On it lay a stack of rough drawing paper, a tin of charcoal sticks, a penknife, and a half-carved wooden spoon with a pattern of prairie wildflowers curling up the handle. A banjo rested on its peg on the wall above. "I draw a little," he said, almost shyly, "and I carve. And in the evening, sometimes I play the banjo if the boys will put up with it. Mama used to sing the old Irish songs of an evening. I cannot sing like she did, but I can keep the tunes alive after a fashion." Clara picked up the half-finished wooden spoon and turned it in her hands. The wildflowers were delicate as lace. She thought of the white lace on her wedding dress, now a ruin drying on a nail in the back room, and she thought how strange it was that a hard-bearded man with a hunting knife could carve something finer than anything she had ever sewn. "It is beautiful, Obie. It is not finished. Neither am I." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he laughed. It was the first sound of laughter the Hollowgrove cabin had heard in a very long time, and it broke something open in the air of the room that had been sealed shut since 1866. The days after that ran together the way days do when a person is learning what a home feels like from the beginning. Claire insisted on earning her place, and the Hollowgroves, each in his own way, let her. She took over the cooking because it was the thing she knew best, and because her mother Eliza had taught her how to make a great deal out of very little long before the fire had taken the print shop. She made cornmeal biscuits with bacon drippings. She made stews from elk and wild onion and the last of the autumn potatoes. She learned from Obie how to mix wild honey into coffee so that it tasted like a Sunday rather than a Tuesday. She baked bread in the black iron oven, and on the third morning, the smell of baking bread came up through the floorboards and woke the whole cabin. And when she came down the stairs, Silas was standing at the foot of them in his stocking feet, and he was just looking at the oven as if the smell itself had hurt him a little. "My mother used to bake on Thursdays," he said when he felt her watching him. "Today is Thursday, Silas." Yes, I had not realized. That was all he said, but he ate 3 thick slices with butter, and he kept his eyes on his plate while he ate. And Clara understood in the slow way that she was beginning to understand everything on the Bitterroot, that some kindnesses in this house would have to be offered sideways, the way you offer a sugar cube to a skittish horse. On the 5th morning, Silas asked her if she could stand the sight of blood. "I can," she said. "My mother was a doctor's helper in St. Louis. She taught me to clean and bind a wound and never to flinch at what a body shows you. I am not delicate about such things, Silas." "Then come with me this afternoon. I am bringing in a deer from the North Trap line, and I will need to dress it in the back lot. It is not quality woman's work, but we do not hold to that distinction up here. On this mountain, we do not have man's work and woman's work. We have the work that needs doing and the hands that are free. Then I am free." So she stood in the snow behind the cabin that afternoon while Silas hoisted an old mule deer doe from a crossbeam and taught her patient and quiet, as he did everything, how to open a carcass the right way, so nothing was wasted. He placed his big calloused hand over her small one, where she gripped the knife, and he guided the first slow cut, and his voice at her shoulder was low and even, and he did not hurry her. And he did not flinch when her hand shook, and he said, "Good. Good, Clara. Now a little deeper. That is how you honor the animal. That is how you feed a house. She did not flinch, not at the blood and not at the weight of his hand over hers. When it was done, he looked at her for a long moment, at her honey hair fallen loose around a face smudged with honest work, at the hem of her borrowed trousers, dark with snow, and he nodded once. "You will do on this mountain, Clara Whitcomb," he said. It was the best thing any man had ever said to her. The evenings were what began to change her. After supper, when the dishes had been washed and the kettle had been set back on the hob for anyone who wanted more coffee, the four of them would gather by the fire in the big downstairs room. Ransom would clean his rifle slowly, the same rifle every night. The long motions of a man who had learned in the army that a weapon was a thing to be respected and that the respect was a form of prayer. Obie would take up his charcoal or his knife and work on a new drawing or a new spoon. Silas would sit in his father's old leather chair with a tin cup of coffee going cold between his hands and look into the fire and say almost nothing. And Clara, on the third evening, pulled down the copy of Pride and Prejudice from the shelf of Marin's books and sat in the rocking chair with the old rose shawl around her shoulders and asked in a voice that was suddenly very shy, "Would it trouble any of you if I read aloud?" Three heads lifted. "My mother read to us in the evenings," Silas said at last, and his voice was hoarse. "Mostly from that very book. She used to say there was no better way to end a hard day than with Mr. Darcy being insufferable and Miss Bennet being patient." "Then," said Clara, "will you let me read you a chapter tonight?" "Yes," he said, "please." She opened the book. The spine cracked softly in the quiet room. A pressed wildflower, dry and brown, with 40 years of keeping, slipped from between the pages and fluttered down to her lap. She picked it up gently. She did not ask whose it had been. She knew. She laid the flower carefully on the little table beside the rocker, and she began to read. Her voice was not trained. She was only 18, and she had no stage in her manner. But she had been read to every night of her childhood, and so she knew how to give a sentence its weight and a character. A face. Within a few pages, Ransom had stopped cleaning his rifle. Within 10 pages, Obie had set down his carving. Within half an hour, Silas Hollowgrove had closed his eyes not to sleep, but to listen, and the firelight was doing something kind to the hard line of his scar. When she finished the chapter, no one spoke at first. The fire popped. The wind pressed on the walls. Then Silas opened his eyes and said, "Tomorrow night, Clara, if you are willing. The next chapter." "I am willing. Every night if you will have us. Every night." And so it began. The fourth quiet thing that knit the four of them together after the meals and the chores and the shared work. Clara each evening reading aloud from the books Marin Ashcroft Hollowgrove had carried out of Boston in 1854, and the three brothers listening each in his own way. Ransom, who stopped cleaning his rifle at the start of the hour and never took it up again until she had closed the book. Obie, who had begun, she noticed on the sixth evening, to draw her while she read small, quick sketches in charcoal on scrap paper. And Silas, who simply listened and who looked at her in the firelight when he thought she was lost enough in the page not to notice. She noticed. She did not say so, but she noticed. Ransom took longer to open than his brothers. Clara did not push him. She understood by then that a man who had been to the frontier wars at 19 was not a man you coaxed. She only kept leaving a clean tin cup of coffee on the workbench in the forge when he went out there at odd hours, and she only kept mending his shirts without comment when she found them folded on the bench with a thread sewn badly through the cuff as a silent ask, and she only kept saving him the end piece of every fresh loaf of bread because Obie had told her offhand that that was the piece their mother used to save for him. On the ninth day, Ransom came into the kitchen when Clara was alone and said, without looking at her, "I am going to teach you to chop kindling. Out back. Come when you are done with that." She came. He stood her in front of the chopping block and put an axe in her hands and corrected her grip with a rough, impatient tap and told her to never, ever cross-hand the strike. And he did not smile once, but at the end of the hour he said, "That will do for a city girl." She took it like the medal it was. On the evening of the 12th day, Clara came down early to set the table and saw something on the bench beside her place that had not been there in the morning. It was a spoon, a wooden spoon of pale curly maple carved to a high polish with a pattern of prairie wildflowers winding up the handle. It was the spoon she had held in her hands the first day when Obi had called it unfinished. It was finished now. She picked it up. Her eyes pricked. She looked up and saw Obi in the corner stirring the stew with his back to her, very carefully not turning around. And she understood that she was not meant to make a fuss, so she did not. She set the spoon at her place like the good silver in a rich woman's house. She used it every supper from that night forward. On the 15th day, she found the sketchbook. She was dusting the little corner table by the window because the snow had kept them in all morning, and she wanted the work of her hands and her elbow brushed the leather-bound sketchbook off the edge. It fell open on the floor. She bent to pick it up, and the breath stopped in her throat. There were drawings inside. She had expected pages and pages of them. Horses at the creek, the shape of a red-tailed hawk in flight, a study of Ransom's forge in firelight, a careful portrait of an old woman she recognized from the tintype on the mantel, Marin Ashcroft Hologrove rendered by a son who was trying very hard to remember her face as it had been. But in the last third of the book, the drawings changed. They were of her. Clara at the stove with the morning light on her hair. Clara reading aloud in the rocker. Clara in Marin's rose shawl looking out the back window at the snow. Clara with her eyes closed beside the fire, listening to something Silas had said. There were at least a dozen of them, and each one had been drawn with a kind of slow attention that no casual hand could fake. And on the very last page, a drawing that was not of her at all. It was of Silas. Silas was standing at the front window, his back half turned, his big shoulders set. He was looking out at the snow, and in the soft charcoal shadow of the room behind him, barely suggested but unmistakable, was Clara, in her rocking chair, reading, not seeing him. The drawing was titled in small, careful letters at the bottom, in what Clara now recognized as Obi's hand. He watches her when she does not see. I have not seen him do that since before the fire. Clara closed the book with shaking hands and set it back on the table exactly as she had found it. She stood for a moment and with her palm pressed flat against the worn leather cover, and her heart was doing a thing in her chest that she did not know the name for yet, and she thought very clearly, oh, that is what that is. She did not tell Obi she had seen it. She did not tell Silas. She only went back to dusting, and her cheeks were warmer than the stove accounted for, and the shape of the afternoon had changed forever. On the 17th night, the big storm came. The wind came down off the pass at dusk with a voice like a freight train in a tunnel, and by full dark, the temperature had dropped 30 degrees and the snow was flying sideways thick enough that Obi could not see the barn from the kitchen window, and the old cabin groaned on its beams like a ship in heavy water. And Ransom was not in it. He had gone up to the East Ridge line that morning to check a trap set that had not been run in a week, and he had promised to be home by supper, and supper was long past, and his seat at the long pine table was empty, and the coffee in his cup had gone cold. Silas stood at the front window with his forehead pressed against the cold glass for a very long time, looking into the white wall where the world used to be. Then he turned and walked to the pegs by the door and began to put on his heaviest coat. "No," said Obi quietly. "I am not asking Obi. I know you are not, but I am saying no anyway. You cannot find him in this. You will wander off the trail in 50 yards, and we will bury two brothers instead of one. Then I wander off the trail, but I do not sit in this warm house while my brother freezes because I was afraid of a wind." Clara had not moved from the hearth. Her hands were locked together in her lap. She said in a voice that was steadier than she felt, "Silas, what will you need? I will get it while you pin the coat." He looked at her. Something in his face when he looked at her in that moment was the same thing that had been in his face in the alley behind the blacksmith's shop. It was grief waiting to happen. It was the face of a man who did not want to leave and who was going to leave anyway because leaving was the decent thing. "Rope," he said, "the long one from the hook behind the stove. The lantern with the storm hood, matches in the oiled tin, the flask of whiskey from the shelf for him, not for me, and the old bearskin rolled in the loft. He will not be walking when I find him, if I find him. She was already moving. So was Obi. They gathered everything in under a minute, the way people do when a house has gone into the particular emergency it has been half expecting for years. Silas pulled on his coat, his scarf, his heaviest gloves. He slung the rope over one shoulder. He took the lantern in his left hand and the Winchester in his right. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Clara. Clara, yes. If I am not back in the 4 hours, you do not send Obi after me. Do you hear me? He stays in this house and he keeps you alive. And come daylight, you ride out together and you do not look for me. Promise me that. She could not make her mouth form the word. He saw that she could not. And then, because there was no time, Silas Hollow did a thing he had not done in the 21 days she had lived under his roof. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and he took her face between his 2 big, rough hands, and he looked down at her with his whiskey-colored eyes gone very dark, and he said, Clara Whitcomb, a man keeps his word. I gave you mine the night I brought you up this mountain. I am coming back. I am coming back to this house, and to this hearth, and to you. Do you hear me say it? I hear you. Then say it back. You are coming back. Yes. He let her go. He turned. He opened the door. The storm came in on him like a living thing, and then the door closed, and he was gone into the white. The 3 hours that followed were the longest Clara had known since the alley in Bear's Hollow. Obi paced. Clara built the fire higher and set a second kettle on for whatever warm thing might be needed when the men came back. She did not let herself say if the men came back. She said when. She said it over and over in her head like a prayer rope. When they come back. When Silas comes back. When. At the end of the 3rd hour, Obi stopped pacing and stood very still at the front window. And then he said very low, Clara, get the blankets. Get all of them. Now, she ran. The door banged open against the wall, and Silas Hollowgrove came in backwards, dragging a bundled figure by the shoulders, his beard white with ice, his eyebrows white, the whole front of him a statue of frost. The figure he was dragging was Ransom, wrapped in the old bearskin, half conscious, his right leg bent at an angle a leg should not bend. A broken snowshoe was still lashed to his boot. Blood had frozen dark along the bearskin where bone had pushed its skin. Table, Silas croaked. On the table, Obi clear the table. They cleared the long pine table with 2 sweeps of their arms. They laid Ransom on it. Clara did not hesitate. She did not wait to be told. She bent over the youngest Hollowgrove brother and took his cold, wet glove in her hands and chafed it and listened at his mouth for breath. He is breathing. Shallow. Get his boots off, not fast. Warm him slow or we will stop his heart. Obi the kettle of warm water, not hot warm. Silas. I need every clean cloth in this house in the tin of lard from the kitchen. I also need 2 straight lengths of board as long as from his hip to his heel planed and as smooth as you can give me, in strips of torn sheet at least 2 fingers wide. She did not recognize her own voice. She was not asking. She was telling. And the 2 brothers were moving before she had finished the sentence, because there was a woman in the house who knew something they did not know, and because they had the sense to follow her. For the next 2 hours, she worked on Ransom Hollowgrove's broken leg by firelight, the way her mother Eliza had taught her 1,500 miles ago in the back room of a doctor's house in St. Louis. She set the bone. Ransom made a sound through his teeth that she would remember forever, and she kept going anyway because stopping would have been crueler than finishing. She bound the leg between the 2 smooth boards Silas had planed for her in 20 minutes at the forge. She pressed warm cloths to the frostbitten places on his cheeks and fingers. She tipped a spoonful of honeyed whiskey between his lips. She covered him in 3 quilts and moved him very gently with Silas and Obi, lifting at the shoulders and the good leg to the long bench by the hearth, where the heat could reach him slow and steady. When it was done, she sat down on the floor beside the bench because her knees had stopped wanting to hold her up. And she took Ransom's cold hand in both of hers, and she did not let go. Silas Hollow stood in the middle of his own kitchen in a puddle of melting snow, his rifle still in his hand, and looked at her. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he set the rifle down very carefully against the wall, and he walked over to where she sat on the floor beside his youngest brother. And he knelt down in the puddle so that his eyes were level with hers, and he lifted one cold, bare finger and tucked a strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear. It was the first deliberate touch he had given her in 3 weeks. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. "Clara Whitcomb," he said, very quiet. "I do not know who your mother was, but wherever she is tonight, she ought to be told that her daughter saved my brother's life." Clara could not answer. She only closed her eyes and leaned her cheek very faintly into the side of his hand, where it still rested near her face. And Silas Hollow, who had not let himself feel a thing of this shape in 8 long years, did not pull his hand away. Later that night, when Ransom was sleeping the deep drugged sleep of a body that had decided to live, and Obi was dozing upright in the chair beside him, and the storm outside had softened from killing to merely cruel, Clara and Silas sat alone on the bench in front of the hearth. The fire was low. The coffee was bitter with reheating. Silas was looking into the embers the way he always did when he was about to say something he had been carrying a long time. "Clara," he said, "I owe you a story." "You do not owe me anything, Silas." "I do, because you asked me once in the storm why I brought you up this mountain, and I told you about my mother. And that was true, but it was not the whole answer. There is another piece of it that you are owed now, because tonight you put your hands on my brother's bones and kept him in this world, and a woman who has done that for me is a woman I will not lie to by leaving things out." She waited. "Her name was Delphine Sinclair," he said. He told her then slowly in the voice of a man taking down a box from a high shelf in a closed room. 8 years ago, when he had been 23, a family had come through Bears Hollow out of Portland, Oregon. The father was a merchant looking for a place to set up a store. The daughter was named Delphine, and she had dark hair and a laugh like a bell, and she had taken one look at the long-jawed mountain man with the skirt and had decided she wanted him. Silas, young and starving for something he had not let himself want since the fire had courted her for 3 months up and down Bears Hollow like a man walking on glass. He had asked her to marry him at the end of an October afternoon when the aspens were gold. She had said yes. She had come up the mountain twice to see the cabin. After the second visit, she had told him to sell it. She wanted a storefront in the hollow, Silas said, looking into the coals. She wanted a painted house on a main street. She said the mountain was cruel and the winter was long, and no woman should be asked to carry water from a well in December. And she was not wrong, Clara. She was not wrong about any of it. This is a hard place. It is a hard place to ask anyone to live. But this cabin is what my father built with his own hands before he died. And this is where my mother sleeps, under the tamarack up the ridge, and I could not sell it. I tried to tell her that. She did not want to hear it. What happened? 3 weeks before the wedding, a drummer came through the hollow. A traveling goods man out of San Francisco, soft hands, a silver watch chain. He said pretty words at the Lucky Ace about a big clean city by the sea where women could have pianos and new dresses. Delphine went back to Portland with him on the next stage. She left me a note at the depot. I still have it upstairs in a drawer. I have not read it since the night she wrote it. It says I was a good man and she was sorry, but she could not be the woman I needed because the woman I needed would have to love this mountain the way I did, and she did not. And she was right about that too. He turned the tin cup in his hands. For 8 years since then, Clara, I have believed two things. The first is that I was not made to be loved. Some men are, and some men are not, and I was on the wrong side of that line. The second is that this mountain had ruined me for any kind of happiness that required company. I had made my peace with it. Figured I would die up here with my brothers and be buried next to my mother under that tamarack. And that would be the shape of Silas Hollowgrove's life, and it would be a decent enough shape, all things considered. He looked up at her then. The whiskey in his eyes was very dark in the low firelight. And then 3 weeks ago, I walked down an alley in Bears Hollow, And I saw a girl in a white dress that she had made with her own hands. And I saw her lift her chin at two drunks, even though she was scared half to death. And I heard her tell me in my own kitchen that she would rather choose good than safe. And I watched her read Jane Austen aloud to three hard men who had forgotten what being read to felt like. And tonight I watched her set the bones of my brother's leg at the same pine table my mother used to roll out her bread on. And I have been sitting here, Clara, and I have been thinking that maybe I was wrong about the first thing. I do not know yet. I am too old and too stupid and too scarred to know yet. But I am thinking that maybe I was wrong. Clara Whitcomb, 18 years old in Marin. Ashcroft's faded rose shawl reached across the narrow space between them on the hearth bench and laid her small hand over the big scarred hand that held the tin cup. Silas Hollowgrove, she said, you were wrong. He closed his eyes. He did not pull his hand away from under hers. The fire popped once soft and small, and outside the cabin, the long, hard winter kept on doing what winters do. And for the first time since 1866, the man with the scar on his jaw sat in his father's house beside a woman who had chosen with her eyes open to keep her hand on his. 2 days later, Obie rode down to Bears Hollow for powders and bandage cloth for Ransom's leg and came back before dark with a folded square of rough printed paper in his coat and a face the color of wet ash. He laid the paper on the pine table without a word and let Clara read it for herself. Lost property. Reward $300. The words were as cold as the wind. Clara Whitcomb, age 18, honey blonde hair, blue eyes last seen in white bridal lace. Bonded passenger property of the estate of A. Creel, held in satisfaction of debt by J. Thorne of Bears Hollow. Deliver alive. Reward paid in coin on site. Contact J. Thorne or his agent, Ezekiel Thorne, at the Lucky Ace. $300 was more than most men in the territory would make in a year. Zeke Thorne is in town, Obie said quietly. He came up from Denver on the Tuesday stage. He has pulled in 4 guns already and is asking around for 2 more. He does not know exactly where we live, but he knows the Hollow Grove name and he knows the Bitterroot, and he is asking the right questions in the wrong saloons. Clara's knees had gone soft. She sat down on the bench. I should go, she whispered. I cannot let any more of this come down on you. I should go to Helena. I should find. No, said Silas. The word fell between them like an axe. No, he said again more quietly. You will not go. Jasper Thorne burned my mother alive 12 years ago for a piece of mountain he wanted. Tonight he is sending his brother up that same mountain for a woman he calls property. This is not about you anymore, Clara. This has never been only about you. This is an old debt of our own, and it is finally coming due. And on this mountain, debts of that shape are not settled by judges in Helena. They are settled by men who keep their word. She looked at him. She looked at Obie still in his coat at the door. She looked up the stairs toward where Ransom lay sleeping his slow-healing sleep with a splinted leg and a loaded Colt on the table beside his pillow. Then she did something she had been turning over in her mind for a week. I need to go down to Bears Hollow, she said. All 3 of the Hollowgroves started. Clara, absolutely not. Listen to me, Silas. One time, I am not going to the Lucky Ace. I am going to the telegraph office. I am going to see Quinlan Perkins, the man who saved my life the day I stepped off that stagecoach by telling me the truth and pushing me out his back door. He kept a copy of Amos Creel's bond paper. He told me so. If that paper goes to the right lawyer in Helena, the whole thing is worth less than the rag it is written on, and Jasper Thorne's reward poster is nothing more than kidnapping. Written on newsprint. I can write the letter myself. I can send it in Perkins's name through Perkins's own wire. But I have to go. Silas shook his head. It is too dangerous. Everything is too dangerous, Silas. Staying is too dangerous. Leaving is too dangerous. Sitting still is too dangerous. I have been a thing that was done to other people for my whole life. I would like just once to be the woman who did a thing back. Please, let me do this one thing back. He looked at her for a very long moment. Obi goes with you, in the wagon, not on horseback. You go in at dawn when the town is still asleep. You go to Perkins and to no one else. You do not stop at the store. You do not look at the lucky ace. You come straight home, and you carry the small pistol I am going to teach you to fire tonight in the pocket of that shawl the whole way there and the whole way back. Yes, Silas, say it. I carry the pistol. I speak to Perkins. I come straight home. Good. That night, in the last hour of daylight behind the cabin, Silas Hollogrove placed a small Smith & Wesson pocket revolver in Clara Whitcomb's small hands and taught her how to hold it without hurting herself and how to aim it without closing both eyes and how to pull the trigger on a slow breath. She was not a natural shot. She was not a bad one either. After 15 minutes, she could put a ball into a pine round at 10 paces 3 times out of 5, and Silas said, low and serious, "That will do for a first day. A woman ought to know how to stand up for herself in this country. I will not have you unready." She slipped the little pistol into the deep pocket of Marin Ashcroft Hollogrove's faded rose shawl. 2 mornings later, Clara and Obi rolled into Bear's Hollow at first light in the wagon. She went in hooded and shawled, and nobody paid her any mind. She slipped into the back door of the telegraph office. Quinlan Perkins looked up from his morning coffee and went pale as flour when he saw who it was, and then something else moved in his face, something that was almost pride. "Miss Whitcomb, Mr. Perkins, I have come to ask you to help me do a very large thing with a very small piece of paper." "I am listening." They worked for an hour. Perkins pulled the copy of Creel's bond from his locked drawer. Clara wrote a long, careful letter in her neat schoolroom hand, dressed to a lawyer and Helena Perkins, knew by reputation a man named Cyrus Fairchild, who had written angry columns in the Helena Herald about frontier contracts that tried to bond women as property. She explained the whole of it. She enclosed a clean copy of Creel's bond and a sworn written statement from Quinlan Perkins himself about the death of Amos Creel and the threats that had been made in Bears Hollow against her life since. She sealed the packet. Perkins put it into the morning stage bound for Helena with his own hands. "Miss Whitcomb," he said at the door as she was leaving, "if this reaches the right man and if the right man takes it up, Jasper Thorne will not be a man who owns a town by the end of this winter. He will be a man in a cell, or he will be a man in the ground. I want you to understand what you have just set in motion." "I understand. Are you afraid?" "Yes, Mr. Perkins, but I am more afraid of going back to being the kind of person things happen to." He nodded slowly. "Go home, Miss Whitcomb. Go home to your mountain." She rode back up the Bitterroot in the wagon with Obi, the sealed outcome of her own life, moving east toward Helena in another wagon behind them, and for the first time since her father had laid that newspaper down by her teacup in St. Louis, Clara Whitcomb felt the peculiar, hard, clean feeling of a woman who had taken a hand in her own fate. That evening, while Silas was out at the barn settling the horses for the night, Clara went quietly up to the little room under the eaves and lifted from the cedar chest the bundle she had not touched in 20 days. She carried it back down the stairs and out the back door and across the packed snow behind the cabin. She did not tell anyone where she was going. Silas saw her from the barn and stopped what he was doing, and he understood, and he did not follow. She built a small fire in a ring of stones at the edge of the yard. She fed it kindling until it was strong. Then she unwrapped the bundle. The white lace wedding dress lay in her hands, torn at the hem from the St. Louis stagecoach platform, stained at the knees from the snow of the alley behind the blacksmith's shop, frayed at the sleeves where 2 drunk men had grabbed her. The pearl buttons from her mother's dress still catching what little morning light there was. Clara held the dress up against herself one last time and looked at it. She thought of the girl who had sewn it by candlelight in a coal house in Missouri. That girl had sewn every stitch, believing that looking like a bride would make her feel like one. That girl had been wrong. That girl had also been brave in a small, desperate way, and Clara wanted her to know before she let her go that the bravery had counted. "Thank you," Clara whispered to the dress. "Thank you for carrying me this far. I do not need you anymore. I am not the girl you were sewn for. I am going to be someone new now. I do not know her whole name yet, but I know her last name will not be Creel, and it will not be Thorn, and it will not be any man's property. That I can tell you. She laid the white lace into the fire. It went up fast. Lace burns fast. In under a minute, the dress was gone, just a soft white drift of ash curling up into the cold gray air above the bitterroot. The pearl buttons she saved. She held them in her closed fist until the fire had died, and then she put them in her shawl pocket beside the little pistol, because some things from an old life were worth carrying into a new one, and some things were not, and a woman ought to know the difference. When she came back into the warm kitchen of the cabin, Silas Hollow was waiting for her at the long pine table with 2 tin cups of coffee poured and a small wildflower honey jar open between them. He did not ask what she had been doing. He only looked at her face in the lamplight, at the faint smudge of ash on her cheek and the wet shine of her eyes, and he pushed one of the cups across the table to her, and he said very quiet, the way a man says a thing he has been practicing under his breath all afternoon. Winter always ends, Clara Whitcomb. My mother used to say so. I believe her tonight more than I have in 12 years. Clara Whitcomb wrapped both small hands around the warm tin cup. The pearl buttons from her mother's wedding dress clinked softly in the pocket of Marin Ashcroft Hollowgrove's rose shawl. Somewhere down in the town of Bears Hollow, Jasper Thorne was pouring himself a whiskey and telling his brother Zeke to ride up the mountain at first light with 6 guns. Somewhere east in Helena, a sealed packet of paper with her name on it was rattling along in the dark toward a lawyer who did not yet know he was about to be handed the fight of his life. And in the warm cabin on the Bitterroot, a girl from St. Louis who had stepped off a stagecoach 24 days ago in a white lace dress lifted her eyes across a pine table to a man with a long, pale scar and said very simply, "Yes, Silas, I believe her too." The word from Helena did not come back fast, but on the Bitterroot, nothing came back fast in January. And so the Hollowgroves lived in the space between the letter sent and the letter answered the way mountain people always live, in the space between the act and its consequence. They lived by keeping the fire built and the horses fed and the watch set on the ridgeline, because a woman had made herself the mistress of her own fate, and the men of the house had promised, each in his own quiet way, to hold the world still long enough for the answer to arrive. 10 days passed after Clara's ride to Bears Hollow. Ransom's leg knit slow but clean under the splints she had set, and on the 4th day he could sit up, and on the 7th he could stand braced with one hand on the long pine table, and on the 9th he demanded in a voice that would not be argued with his rifle. Not the short Colt. The long-range Sharps rifle he kept in oilcloth in the corner of his room, the one with the brass-mounted tang sight he had soldered on himself by lamplight. At 18, the rifle that had ridden with him in the Powder River campaign and come home quieter than he had. Silas brought the Sharps down to him without a word. Obie brought a canvas sack of fine gun cotton and a tin of percussion caps and a handful of long, heavy cartridges Ransom had been loading himself at the forge since he was 16 years old. Ransom sat on the bench by the hearth with the rifle across his thighs and the splinted leg stretched long on a stool, and he cleaned the Sharps the way other men read scripture, slow and murmuring. And then he looked up at Silas with flat blue eyes and said, "I can shoot from a sitting rest. I can shoot from a lying rest. I can shoot from any rest this house can give me. If Zeke Thorne brings men up this trail, I will be ready for them. You put me in the loft window with this rifle and a bag of flour for a pad, and I will hold that window till the Lord calls me home. You understand me, brother?" "I understand you, Ransom." "Say it proper. You hold the loft window. Nobody gets past you. Nobody gets past me." It was the most Clara had ever heard Ransom Hollowgrove say in one sitting. She was at the stove ladling stew into bowls when he said it, and she did not turn around because she did not want him to see her face soften, because Ransom was a man who did not yet know how to take softening from a woman without flinching. But she took the end piece of the fresh loaf and cut it extra thick, and she set it on his plate with a little more butter than strictly polite, and when he ate it without comment, that was all the thanks either of them needed. Silas spent those 10 days making the cabin into something nearer a fort without ever calling it that. He and Obi cut shooting ports low in the thick shutters, small enough that a rifle could angle through, and a bullet could not angle in. They packed the root cellar with extra blankets and water and a loaded shotgun for last defense, because the root cellar had a second door that opened into a blind of brush up the hill and might one day be the only way out for a woman and a wounded brother. They drew buckets of water at every dusk and stacked them inside along the kitchen wall so no fire started by a thrown torch would find them without a way to fight it. They greased the leather hinges. They oiled every weapon in the house twice. And every morning at first light, Silas rode the high timber above the cabin for an hour to check for sign, and every evening at last light he rode it again, and every night he came in and stamped the snow off his boots and hung his coat on the peg and said the same short sentence to Clara before he did anything else. "Nothing today, Clara Whitcomb, nothing on the trail." And every night she said back, "Then today was a good day, Silas Hollowgrove." And each of them would feel the other's words settle somewhere under the ribs like a stone dropped into a still pool, and neither would say more because more would have been more than the other could yet carry. It was on the 11th day in the middle of the cold afternoon that Silas asked her to walk with him down to the creek. "Not for work," he said. He was standing at the door with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and he was looking at her in a way that made her set down the wooden spoon she was holding without finishing the stir. "Not for water and not for wood, just to walk. There is a place I used to go with my mother when I was a boy. I have not been there in some years. I thought I might go today, and I thought I might show it to you if you would come." Clara took off her apron. She did not ask a single question. She put on the heavy boots and the borrowed wool coat and Marin Ashcroft Hollowgrove's faded rose shawl around her shoulders, under the coat for warmth, and she walked out with him into the thin silver light of a January afternoon in the Bitterroot. He did not take her hand. He walked half a step ahead of her because the snow was deep and he was breaking the path. But every few paces he slowed without turning around so that she would not feel left, and every rise he paused at the top of until she was beside him again. And so they went down to the creek together with only the sound of their boots in the crust and the far-off call of a single crow over the black timber. The creek was mostly frozen. In the middle there was still a narrow lane of open water where it ran too fast to freeze, and the water there was black and swift and clean-looking, and the sun came through a break in the cloud just as they arrived and laid a long gold line down the length of it. Silas stopped. "This is the place," he said. "My mother brought me here in the spring after my father died. I was 19 and I was very angry, Clara, and I did not know what to do with it. She walked me down here without saying a word the same way I just walked you. And when we got here, she sat on that flat rock right there, and she told me a thing I want to say to you today." Clara did not speak. She only looked at him, at the great tall shape of him against the winter trees, at the long, pale scar that traveled from the corner of his eye to his jaw, and that she had come to think of not as a wound, but as a map of how he had loved his brothers enough to run back into a burning barn. She said, "Silas, some men are made for talking, and some men are made for doing, and neither one is better than the other, but a woman will only ever know which kind she has got by watching him over time. A talker will show you his heart in his first week. A doer will show you his heart in his 10th year. So if you find a woman someday," she said, "and you are not a talker, do not try to become one for her sake. You will only lie to her about your own shape. You tell her instead that you are a doer, and then you spend the next 40 years doing, and if she is the right woman, she will read you true in the end. That is what my mother told me, Clara." He turned to face her. He took off his hat, which was a thing Silas Hollowgrove did not do outdoors in winter, except once a year on Christmas morning at his mother's grave, and he held it in both his big, rough hands in front of him. "I am not a talker. I have said more words to you in the last 3 weeks than I have said to any other human soul in 9 years, and I am still not a talker, and I am not going to become one tonight. But I am going to say a short thing, and I want you to know it cost me every word I had in me to say it, and I want you to know it is the only shape I can offer it in. All right, Silas. Clara Whitcomb, I did not believe I was made to be loved. I have told you that already. I am not going to tell you again. What I am going to tell you is this. If you will stay on this mountain with me, not tonight, and not because of Thorn, and not because the world outside is cruel, but because you choose to, I will spend the rest of my life doing, not talking, doing. I will keep this roof on. I will keep you fed. I will keep you warm. I will stand between you and anything this country sends at you, and this country sends a great deal at its women. I will read you Jane Austen when you are too tired to read it yourself. I will carry the water from the well in December and in every December after it because my mother once had to, and because a woman who has come this far ought not to carry her own water if there is a man in her house who still has arms. That is what I can give you. That is all of it. It is not a grand offer. It is only the whole of me. Clara Whitcomb stood in the snow beside the black water, and she felt the cold of her mother's wedding ring in her carpet bag back in the cabin, and she felt the cold of the pearl buttons in her shawl pocket from the white lace dress she had burned, and she felt something warmer than either of those things rising up under her breastbone, and she said very clearly, so that there would be no mistaking it in the still winter air, Silas Hollowgrove, I stopped trying to leave this mountain the night I set your brother's leg. I only did not have the courage to say it until you said it first. Yes, I will stay. Not tonight, Silas. Not because of Thorn. Because I choose to. He closed his eyes. Then he stepped forward slow the way he did everything, and he bent his head, and he kissed her once. It was a short kiss. It tasted like coffee and like the cold and like something that had been held back a long time. His beard was rough against her cheek. His big hand came up only for a second and cupped the back of her head, and then he drew back and looked at her as if to make sure she was still there and still looking at him the same way. She was. He put his hat back on. He took her hand in his for the first time openly without excuse. They walked back up to the cabin through the snow, and neither of them said another word on the way, and neither of them needed to. 3 days later, in the blue last hour before dawn, Ransom Hollowgrove said from his post at the loft window, "Quiet as a cat, they are coming." The cabin came alive without a shout. Silas was already up, already dressed, already at the front shutter. Obie was on his feet with the double-barrel shotgun across his chest before his eyes were fully open. Clara pulled on Marin's wool coat over her nightdress and slipped the little Smith & Wesson into the pocket and came down the stairs two at a time, and Silas met her at the bottom and took her by both shoulders and looked down into her face in the lamplight. "The loft," he said, "behind Ransom, not beside him, behind him. You keep that pistol in your hand and you do not come down no matter what you hear. I do not care if I shout for you. I do not care if I scream. You do not come down those stairs. Do you hear me, Clara?" "I hear you." "Say it." "I stay in the loft. I do not come down." "Good." He pulled her close for a half second, pressed his lips to her forehead, and let her go. She was up the pine steps before she could feel the fear in her knees. In the blue light through the loft window, she could see them now with her own eyes. 7 riders coming slow up the last bend of the mountain trail, black shapes against the snow rifles across their thighs. The man in front rode a heavy bay and sat too straight in the saddle for a mountain rider. That would be Ezekiel Thorne, the brother out of Denver, the one who had never lost a bounty. Ransom lay flat on a bed of folded flour sacks by the shuttered window, the long sharps already on a rest. The brass tang's sight already up his splinted legs stretched long and easy behind him. He did not look at Clara when she came up behind him. He only said low, "Stay down, Miss Whitcomb. And if you hear me grunt, it means I have put a man down. Do not jump at the sound of the sharps. She speaks loud in close quarters. I will not jump, Ransom. Good. Down below, Silas opened the front shutter a crack and called out into the winter dawn in a voice that carried easy over the snow. Zeke Thorne, that is close enough. You say your piece from there. The lead rider drew rein 100 paces out. Clara could see the shape of him clearly now. Tall, lean, long-coated, a black hat pulled low. His voice came back flat and carrying. Hollowgrove, I have the paper on a bonded passenger named Clara Whitcomb. She is the legal property of the estate of one Amos Creel, held in satisfaction of debt by my brother Jasper Thorne of Bears Hollow. I am here to collect her. You hand her out, and I ride these men back down the mountain, and nobody on either side takes a bullet this morning. You hold her, and I burn this cabin around your ears, and I will not be as careful about it as my brother was in '66. You have 1 minute, Hollowgrove. There was a long beat of silence in the cabin. Clara could hear Silas breathing. She could hear Ransom breathing. She could hear her own heart. And then Silas Hollowgrove said loud and even the words that Clara Whitcomb would carry inside her ribs for the rest of her natural life. Zeke Thorne, your brother killed my mother and father in that barn 12 years ago. That debt has been sitting in the snow between our families ever since. As for Clara Whitcomb, she is no man's property, and she never was, not in St. Louis and not in Bears Hollow and not on this mountain. She is my wife in everything but the words, and the words will come as soon as the spring thaw lets a preacher up this trail. You will not take her off this porch alive. That is my answer. Ride down or die up. Zeke Thorne laughed. It was a short, ugly laugh. He lifted his rifle. He did not get the shot off. Up in the loft, the long brass tang sight of Ransom Hollowgrove's Sharp's rifle settled on a point just below the black hat band of the lead rider, and Ransom let his breath out the slow way the Powder River had taught him, and on the bottom of the breath the Sharp spoke. The sound of it in the loft was like a barn door slamming in the face of God. Clara's teeth rang in her jaw. Down on the trail, Ezekiel Thorne came off his horse without a sound and was dead before his body met the snow. The 6 riders behind him scattered into the timber for cover, with a volley of wild rifle fire that broke the front windows of the cabin and sent splinters of pine skating across the floor. Silas returned fire from the lower shutter with the Winchester steady and spaced the way a man shoots when he is not panicking. Obie fired the shotgun twice out the side window at a rider who had tried to come around the barn, and the rider went down, and the horse bolted riderless into the trees. From the loft above, the Sharps spoke again, and then a third time, slow and patient and final. Ransom Hollowgrove in the Powder River had shot men at 600 yards in a sleet storm, and at 100 paces from a rest in his own father's cabin he did not miss. It was over in under 6 minutes. Clara Whitcomb counted them on the watch pinned to her nightdress because counting was the only thing her hands could do that was not shaking. 3 of Zeke Thorne's men lay in the snow of the front trail. 2 more had broken and run for Bears Hollow without looking back. One had been taken alive in the trees by Obie, who walked him up to the cabin with the shotgun at his back and sat him on the porch step in his own blood, tied and weeping. Silas Hollowgrove took a round through the meat of his left shoulder in the second minute of the fight. It went clean through, which was the kind of luck a man took and thanked the Lord for without complaint. He came up the stairs to the loft as soon as the firing stopped, holding his arm, and the first thing he did when he saw Clara was say, "Are you whole?" "I am whole." "Silas, your shoulder." "It is a through and through. It will keep until I see that you are whole." "I am whole. I am whole. Sit down. Let me see it." She made him sit on the top step of the loft, and she cut the shirt back from the wound with her sewing scissors, and she cleaned it, and she packed it, and she bound it with strips torn from a clean sheet and all of it, the way her mother Eliza had taught her in St. Louis. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. Silas watched her work with his whiskey-colored eyes, and he did not flinch when she probed the wound, and when she tied the last knot, he said very quietly so that only she could hear, "Clara Whitcomb, a man could get used to being kept alive by your hands." "Then you had better plan on it," Silas Hollow. Downstairs, Ransom had hauled himself up off his sacks and come down the ladder on his good leg, and was sitting at the long pine table with a cup of cold coffee and a face like a stone wall. Obie had built up the fire again. The front shutters hung splintered. The loft window was blown out to the frame, but the cabin was still standing, and the Hollow Groves were all four of them, still standing, and the morning sun had come up over the ridge while nobody was watching it and was now laying long gold bars through the broken shutters onto the plank floor. They did not celebrate. That was not the shape of them. They only cleaned up what had to be cleaned and fed the horses and sat down to coffee and bread at 10 o'clock in the morning like men who had done a hard, necessary piece of work. It was at 11 that the lone rider came up the trail. He came in alone, no weapons drawn, a white kerchief tied to his raised left hand in the frontier signal of parley. He was old and he was heavy, and he sat his horse like a man who had not been on one in 15 years. A silver-headed walking stick rested across his thigh, a fine black wool coat, a white beard trimmed close to the jaw, blue eyes gone cold as river stones. Jasper Thorne, 54 years old, owner of the mines, burner of barns, the last living man in the world whose name could still make Silas Hollowgrove's jaw go tight. Silas went out onto the porch with the Winchester cradled in his good arm. Clara came to the doorway behind him, Marin's rose shawl pulled tight at her throat, the little Smith & Wesson still in her pocket. Obie was at the side of the cabin with the shotgun low. Up in the loft unseen, Ransom was already back on his flour sacks, with the sharps rested through the broken window, and the long brass tang sight trained very calmly on the center of Jasper Thorne's black coat. Jasper Thorne drew rein 30 paces out. He smiled. It was the same small, cold smile Clara had been imagining for weeks. Silas Hollowgrove, I see you have done some shooting this morning. I have. My brother. In the snow, about 40 paces behind you. Well, Jasper tilted his head as if considering a small inconvenience. Well, that is a thing that will have to be answered for. I want you to listen to me now, Silas, because I am going to be very clear. I sent a telegram from Bears Hollow this week. It went down the line to Helena. The United States Marshal will be reading it tomorrow or the day after. In that telegram, I accused the Hollowgrove brothers of the cold-blooded murder of my brother Ezekiel and of several of my employees, and of the unlawful harboring of my lawfully bonded property, one Clara Whitcomb. When the federal marshal comes up this mountain, Silas, he will come with enough men to finish what I start today, and he will come with a rope for the three of you and a set of wrist irons for the girl. Unless what, Thorne? Unless I send a second telegram this afternoon retracting the whole thing, calling it a misunderstanding, saying the Hollowgrove boys and I have settled our differences like gentlemen. I will send that second telegram today if you hand the girl down off this porch to me right now. You keep your mountain. You keep your brothers. I keep the girl and what is owed me. We all live to see another spring. Those are my terms, Silas. Those are the only terms I am offering. 1 minute. Silas Hollowgrove took in a slow breath through his teeth. He was about to answer Jasper Thorne. He was about to answer him in a way that would have been the end of several men in the next 5 seconds, Ransom Sharps included. He did not get the chance. Clara Whitcomb stepped past him out onto the porch. She stepped past him gently, but she stepped past him. Silas made a small, hard sound and reached for her arm, and she laid her small fingers over his knuckles and shook her head one time, and something in her face stopped him. He let her pass. She walked to the top of the porch step and stood there in Marin Ashcroft Hollowgrove's faded rose shawl, with her honey blonde hair loose around her shoulders and her cornflower blue eyes level on the face of Jasper Thorne. And she spoke in a voice that was not the voice of a frightened girl in an alley. It was the voice of a woman who had set a broken bone and burned a wedding dress and sent a letter east to Helena. Mr. Thorne, Miss Whitcomb, I'm going to tell you 3 things, Mr. Thorne, and then I am going to ask you one question. The 3 things are these. First, Quinlan Perkins of the Bears Hollow Telegraph office copied the bond paper of Amos Creel on the very day I arrived in Bears Hollow over a month ago now, and kept the copy in a locked drawer. Second, 11 days ago, with Mr. Perkins' help, I wrote a full sworn account of my journey of my dead groom's debts, of your reward poster, and of your threats against my life, and I enclosed the copy of Creel's bond, and I posted the whole packet by the morning stage to a lawyer in Helena named Cyrus Fairchild. I believe you have heard of Mr. Fairchild. He writes columns in the Helena Herald about men like you. Third, I also asked Mr. Perkins in writing to send a private telegram of his own to the United States Marshal's office in Helena over his own name, and in his own office the moment any reward poster bearing my name appeared in Bears Hollow. Mr. Perkins sent that telegram the same afternoon your poster went up. It has been in the Marshal's hands for over a week now. Jasper Thorne's face did not change, but his gloved hand very slowly tightened on the silver head of his walking stick. Clara went on. Which brings me to my question, Mr. Thorne. When the United States Marshal rides up out of Helena in the next day or two, whose telegram do you imagine he will be reading first? Yours sent this week, or Mr. Perkins's and Mr. Fairchild's sent 11 days ago, with a sworn statement and a copy of a forged bond and a formal request for investigation into the 20-year history of one Jasper Thorne of Bears Hollow, including the barn fire of March 1866 that killed Barnaby and Marin Hollow, and was, as Mr. Fairchild writes in his letter of reply, and I quote him, long overdue for a competent hearing. Clara reached into the pocket of the rose shawl with her left hand and drew out a folded page of cream-colored paper sealed with a lawyer's dark red wax. Mr. Fairchild's reply came up on yesterday's private courier from Helena, Mr. Thorne. The marshal is already on the road. He is not coming to arrest the Hollowgroves. He is coming to arrest you. The silence on the mountain was so big, it had a weight of its own. Jasper Thorne sat on his horse 30 paces from the porch, and for the first time in 12 years, his cold blue eyes were not the coldest thing on the Bitterroot. The coldest thing on the Bitterroot was the smile that did not move on Silas Hollowgrove's mouth. And the second coldest thing is the letter in Clara Whitcomb's hand. Jasper Thorne made his decision the way men like Jasper Thorne always make their last decisions. His right hand dropped for the pistol under his long black coat. He was fast for an old man. He was very fast. He was not faster than the Sharp's rifle resting on a flour sack in the broken loft window of the cabin he had burned 12 years ago. Ransom Hollowgrove let the breath out of his body the slow way the army had taught him, and the long Sharp spoke one last time. Jasper Thorne came off his horse in the exact same piece of snow where his brother Ezekiel had come off his an hour before, and he was dead before the echo of the shot had finished rolling up the canyon. On the porch, Silas Hollowgrove lowered the Winchester he had not even needed to raise. He looked at Clara. Clara looked at him. Neither of them spoke. Up in the loft in the smoke, curling from the Sharps, Ransom Hollowgrove laid his scarred cheek against the stock of his father's old rifle and said so quiet only the rafters heard him, "That was for Mama and Papa. I hope it was loud enough." 2 days later, United States Marshal Augustus Prine, called Gus by men who had known him 20 years, rode up the Bitterroot Trail at the head of 4 deputies and the lawyer Cyrus Fairchild and the depot man Quinlan Perkins. They found the Hollowgrove brothers and Clara Whitcomb waiting at the long pine table, 3 bodies laid out respectful under blankets in the barn, the loft window boarded over with fresh pine planks and coffee on the stove. Gus Prine took one long look around the cabin and at Clara in her rose shawl, and at the splinted leg of Ransom and the bandaged shoulder of Silas, and he said, "Miss Whitcomb, Mr. Fairchild's letter was the most interesting thing to cross my desk in 11 years. On the strength of his filing and the telegrams from Mr. Perkins in this morning's preliminary findings, I am prepared to rule the deaths of Ezekiel and Jasper Thorne the result of lawful self-defense under immediate threat of force. That ruling will stand, Miss Whitcomb. It will stand over anybody in the territory who tries to challenge it, and a certain number of folks down in Bears Hollow are already trying." Mr. Fairchild here has a full docket of other Thorn matters to pursue over the next year, and I suspect he will find that the name Thorn on a lot of papers in Bears Hollow is about to mean considerably less than it did last week. He looked at Silas. Mr. Hollowgrove, your mother and father had a bad night in March of 1866. I was a young deputy in Helena that year, and I heard the whispers, and I could not prove a thing, and it has stuck in my throat ever since. I'm going to reopen that file, sir. I am going to reopen it formally. I cannot bring back your people, but I can put the record right. Silas Hollowgrove did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was hoarse. Marshal Prine, you do that, sir. You put the record right. I would be obliged. I mean to Mr. Hollowgrove, I mean to. Gus Prine took his coffee standing up out of courtesy for a house that had just been shot into, and then he rode back down the mountain with his deputies and his lawyer, and the bodies in a wagon behind them, and the Hollowgrove cabin was left in the quiet afternoon with snow beginning to fall, soft and forgiving, over the blood in the front yard. By that evening, the blood was covered. By the next morning, you could not have told by looking that anything had happened there at all, except for the fresh planks in the loft window and the slow smile that had begun very faintly and very permanently to live at one corner of Silas Hollowgrove's mouth whenever Clara Whitcomb came into a room. Spring came up the Bitterroot that year, the way spring always comes to mountain country, slow and then all at once. The creek broke its ice in the second week of April. The tamaracks put out their first soft green needles at the end of April. By the middle of May, the meadow below the cabin was running wild with lupine and paintbrush and small wet mountain roses, and the sun was warm on the front porch in the middle of the day, and a circuit preacher riding up from Helena to serve the new congregation in Bears Hollow sent word that he would come up the mountain on the third Saturday of the month to marry Silas Hollowgrove and Clara Whitcomb under whatever tree they cared to stand beneath. They chose the old tamarack up the ridge where Barnaby Hollowgrove and Marin Ashcroft. Hollowgrove had lain sleeping side by side in the mountain since the March of 1866. On the morning of the wedding, Obie carried out his banjo. Ransom walking now, with only a slight hitch in his gait that would never quite leave him, and that Clara would come to love, wore the dark suit his father had been married in, altered to fit by Clara's own hands over the winter. Silas wore a clean white cotton shirt that Clara had pressed 3 times, and his father's old silver buckle on his belt, and the long pale scar down his jaw was catching the spring light like something that had been paid for and kept. Clara wore a simple blue linen dress she and Obie had made together from a bolt bought in Bears Hollow on one of the first safe wagon runs of the thaw. It was not lace. It was not white. It did not need to be either of those things because she had burned the girl. Those things were sewn for on a winter morning behind the cabin, and she had walked out of the ashes as someone new. Around her shoulders, she wore Marin Ashcroft Hollowgrove's faded rose shawl. On the third finger of her left hand, her own mother Eliza's thin gold wedding ring, which she had slipped on herself that morning, in front of the mirror with shaking hands, because some rings can only be put on a woman by her mother's ghost and no other. The preacher, a red-faced, kind man named Brother Ellery, read a short passage from the book of Ruth about whither thou goest, and Clara Whitcomb cried at that part without apology, because it was the truest thing about her that any page had ever said out loud. Silas did not cry, but his big calloused hands shook just the once when he took hers to slide his own ring onto her finger, a plain band of hammered silver that Ransom had made for him in the forge, in 2 long quiet nights that winter without being asked. Silas spoke his vows in the voice of a man who had been practicing them for months at the water pump and meant every word. Clara Whitcomb, I am not a talker. I have told you that. I will be a doer. I promise you that I will never let you be hungry. I promise you that I will never let you be cold. I promise you that I will never let you feel alone in a crowd of men again. Not in this house and not in any house I am standing in. I promise to build onto this cabin every year a little, and to plant corn every spring, and to read the last chapter of every book you ever open for me. I promise that I will love you across every winter this mountain can send, And a man keeps his word, Clara, and this is my word for as long as I draw breath. Clara, with tears on her face and her mother's ring catching the sunlight, said, Silas Hollowgrove, when I stepped off that stagecoach in a white lace dress, I was sure my life had ended. You were the first man in the whole world who ever looked at me like my life had not ended. I promise you that I will love you across every winter this mountain can send. I promise you I will read the first chapter of every book to you in the rocking chair your mother rocked her babies in. I promise you I will put your end piece of bread on your plate every morning of every year we have together. Winter always ends, Silas. I believed you the first time you told me. I believe you today. I will believe you on every day that is left to us. Obie played a slow Irish tune on the banjo that Marin Ashcroft Hollowgrove had hummed to her babies in 1860, and Ransom stood straight with his bad leg propped easy and a look on his face that Clara had never seen there before, which was the look of a man who had at long last put down a weight he did not know he had been carrying. Silas kissed his new wife once gently under the tamarack tree, where his mother slept, and the whole Bitterroot smelled of warm pine and lupine and a spring that had been a long time getting there. Now, friend, let me take you forward, because stories like this one are not truly finished on the day of the wedding. Stories like this one are finished years later on a porch in a summer evening when the shape of the life that was only a promise at the altar has finally become a living thing. 20 years. 20 years on the Bitterroot. It was June of 1898, the evening I want to show you last. The Hollowgrove cabin was not a cabin anymore, so much as a proper house. Silas had kept his word about building on every year. There was a long new porch. There was a great room with real glass windows, shipped up from Helena. There was a second wing where two children had grown up tall, and where a third, the youngest, was still small enough to fall asleep in his father's arms. The barn was bigger now. The corral held 12 horses. Down in the valley below, a small herd of good mountain cattle grazed in the long grass, and above the house the same old tamarack still stood over the graves of Barnaby and Marin Hollowgrove, and now a third stone cut from the creek rock by Obie's own hands, small and plain, that read Eliza Whitcomb, mother to Clara, kept in our house forever. Clara Hollowgrove, 38 years old, with the first threads of silver showing at her temples and her cornflower blue eyes steady as a morning sky, stood on the porch with 3-year-old Barnaby, the second, asleep on her shoulder. Below her in the meadow, her older children were chasing each other through the wildflowers in the long evening light. Marin Whitcomb Hollowgrove, 15. Honey Blonde and Sirius, who already read to her younger brothers in the rocking chair by the fire, the way her mother had read to 3 mountain men a lifetime ago. Eldon, 12, quiet and broad in the shoulders, named for the gentle man in St. Louis who had walked his daughter to a stagecoach and let her go. And a laughing 8-year-old visitor named Obadiah II, who belonged to Obie, and the Helena school teacher Obie had married in 1889 and who had come up the mountain with his parents for the summer, as he did every summer. Ransom Hollowgrove had never married. He lived in a smaller cabin he had built for himself a quarter-mile up the ridge near the forge, where he still shod the horses and sharpened the axes for the whole Bitterroot Valley. He was Uncle Ransom to every Hollowgrove child, and the children climbed him like a tree, and he never once in 20 years said no to any one of them, and the permanent small hitch in his gait made him easier to catch, which the children knew and took unfair advantage of, and Ransom pretended to be offended by it and was not offended by it at all. Silas came up onto the porch behind his wife and set one hand on the small of her back. His hair had silver in it now, too. The scar down his jaw had softened with age. His shoulders were still as broad as a barn door, and his hands were still the hands of a man who did more than he said. He laid his cheek for a second against the top of Clara's head, and she leaned back against him without looking, and the 3-year-old in her arms did not so much as stir. What are you thinking about, Clara Hollowgrove? I am thinking about that stagecoach, the one in St. Louis, the morning my father kissed me goodbye. Still, not in a sad way, Silas, in a kind of wonder. I keep thinking I should tell her something, that girl in the white lace dress. I keep thinking I should lean down over her shoulder on that platform and tell her, wait. Wait, child. It is not what you think. In 20 years, you will be standing on a porch on a mountain in Montana with a baby on your shoulder and a good man's hand on your back, and your own mother's ring will still be on your finger, and 3 Hologrove brothers will have saved your life, and a house full of your own children will be running in a meadow below you, and you will look out across all of it, and you will finally understand that the day you thought your life was ending was actually the day your life was beginning. I keep thinking I should tell her that, so she would not be so scared on the way west. Silas was quiet a long moment. Then he said, she would not have believed you, Clara. She had to come the whole way to find out. I know. I know she did. He turned her gently to face him, the sleeping child still on her shoulder. He lifted her left hand in his big scarred one and pressed his mouth just for a breath to her mother Eliza's thin gold ring. Come inside, Clara Hologrove. Obie is going to play on the porch in a little while. Ransom is tuning the old fiddle Pa left him. Marin is going to read the last chapter of the new book out loud. I want you in the rocking chair by the fire with that baby asleep in your lap when she does. That is where you belong, wife. That has always been where you belong. In the doorway of the great room, hung on a peg on the wall beside the front door, where a visitor's eye would not catch it, but the family's eye always did, there hung a plain brown leather belt with a brass buckle, worn smooth by 20 years of hands. It was the belt Silas Hologrove had been wearing on the night of December the 18th, 1878, when he walked into an alley in Bears Hollow and saw a girl in a white lace dress with her back against a shed wall and her chin lifted the way a frightened thing lifts its chin when it has decided to go down standing up. 15-year-old Marin Hologrove, on her way past with a stack of plates for the supper table, paused in the doorway and tilted her head at the old belt on its peg the way she had tilted her head at it 100 times before. Mama, why does Papa keep that old belt up on the wall? He does not even wear it anymore. Clara Hologrove smiled the slow smile that Silas had watched her grow into over 20 years. That is the belt your father was wearing the night he saved my life, my girl. That is the belt I held onto with both hands when he lifted me up onto midnight in the Bears Hollow snow and turned that horse up this mountain. I thought at the time it was just a belt. I was wrong. It turned out to be the first thing on this mountain I ever held on to without being afraid. Your father put it on that peg on our wedding day. He said it was going to stay there until this house falls down. And after, Silas Hologrove was standing now in the doorway with his arm around his wife's shoulders and his hand resting lightly on the top of his sleeping youngest son's head. The evening sun through the front windows laid a long gold bar across the plank floor of the great room, exactly the way the morning sun had laid one there on the day after the shooting 20 years before. And after, Silas said quietly to his daughter and to his wife and to his sleeping son and to the meadow of running children below, and to the whole long mountain that had tried for 12 years to break him and had not in the end broken him at all. Marin, a man keeps his word. That is what your grandmother told your papa, and that is what your papa told your mama, and that is what your mama tells the 3 of you every night she kisses you. Your mother burned a wedding dress in our yard 20 years ago this winter so she could stop being any man's property. And she stood on this porch and told Jasper Thorne that she was no man's property, and he died in the snow in front of this house for not believing her. And then she put on her own mother's ring, and she married me under the tamarack up the ridge, not because she had to, but because she chose to. That belt on the wall is the only thing left in this house from the girl she used to be. And your mother chose, on the day we were wed, to keep it there because she said some things from an old life are worth carrying into a new one, and some things are not, and a woman ought to know the difference. He kissed his wife on the temple. The baby on her shoulder sighed in his sleep. Down in the meadow, the children were laughing, and Obie was tuning up his banjo on the porch boards, and Ransom was coming up the path from the forge in the last of the sun with the old fiddle in his hand. Clara Hologrove looked out over all of it, the porch and the meadow and the tamarack on the ridge and the mountain going gold under a Montana sunset, and her own hand steady on the back of a child who had been born in a bed her husband had built for her with his own two hands. She remembered a girl in a white lace dress on a platform in St. Louis. She remembered a voice in an alley saying, "Step away from her." She remembered a big, rough hand kneeling down in the snow to put itself at her level so that she would not have to look up. She remembered her mother's ring in a carpet bag and a splinted leg on a pine table and a folded letter with a red wax seal. She remembered burning a dress. She remembered the words, "Winter always ends." And Clara Holligrove, who had once been Clara Whitcomb, who had once been a bonded passenger and the property of a debt she never signed, and the daughter of a broken printer in Missouri, leaned her head against her husband's shoulder in the doorway of the house he had promised her 20 years before he would build. And she said out loud the last three things the storyteller wants you to carry home with you tonight, friend, because they are the three things this mountain taught her, and the three things she has been teaching her children every night of their lives ever since. Winter always ends. A man keeps his word. In this Clara Hollow Grove, this is where you belong.